And we'll finish with Josh, who I've already sort of introduced. So Josh Woodward, everyone. Thank you.
Hello, and apologies for my distracting young child. She's been distracting me all year, so it's good to share that with everyone. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank Georgina, the Institute, Christina for booking the flights and the accommodation, and Damien and Zach for putting on a great ECR program throughout the year. A quick disclaimer, I'll be reading some passages from Menzies' speeches. I won't be attempting an impression. It was a cool morning in March 1964 when 600 delegates representing the tourism industries of 23 Pacific nations arrived at Sydney's chic new Menzies Hotel. Attending for the 13th Pacific Area Travel Association Conference, representatives from the United States, Japan, New Zealand, China, the Philippines, and numerous Pacific islands slowly filled the lobby. What a modern hotel they were in, we can see. Double glazed windows, at the time the tallest window units in Australia, stretched from the first floor lounge to the function room on the floor above. Opened the year before, the 300-room hotel boasted that it had been constructed from the wonder materials of the decade, precast concrete cladding, and bronze anodised aluminium, and probably asbestos. Opened the year before, the dark bronze plating that decorated the walls and fittings gave the lower floors where the delegates were busy gathering and registering an aura of novel elegance that the hotel's owners proudly claimed was unknown in the architecture of its competitors. The Menzies Hotel claim to modernity was also gastronomical. It was the only hotel in the country where a guest could order crêpes Suzette at 3 a.m. Selected by the host organisation, the Australian National Travel Association, to showcase the first-class accommodation available in Australia, the Menzies was a fitting hotel for the convening of an industry that saw itself at the cutting edge of international advertising and public relations. Named after a famed 19th century hotelier, it was also a fitting coincidence that the Menzies shared its name with the conference's much-anticipated keynote speaker. After tea and coffee, guided by the bronze gilding of the central staircase's black timber handrails, the delegates ventured from the lobby to the second-floor function room. From darkened seating arranged under banners bearing the names of PATA's member countries, Philippines, Tahiti, Republic of China, and so on, the gaze of the audience was directed by way of light and sound towards an illuminated centre podium. There stood, at 9:30 a.m, according to Menzies' office diary, the Prime Minister, arriving not long after congratulating his wife, Pat, on the morning of her 65th birthday. The address that Menzies delivered remains surprisingly overlooked both in Australian tourism history and in accounts of the Menzies years. In the speech, he contended that in the modern age of the 1960s, travel had a role to play in eliminating the spiteful antipathy between nations that had so scourged the 20th century. Menzies, by 1964, had formed a view that travel offered nations a powerful means of overcoming difference. Travel, he said, promised to foster peaceful international relations, avert war, and secure lasting peace. This paper, situates Menzies' address at PATA amongst other travel-themed public statements he made on tourism in the 1960s. I aim to explain the political and intellectual ideas underpinning his conviction that travel broadened the mind and invigorated the human spirit. I explore how Menzies' long-formed idealistic outlook, what Greg Melliush, I would struggle, and Stephen Chikura refer to as his philosophic idealism. How did this philosophic idealism contribute to Menzies' travel-themed optimism? I argue further that there were additional paradigms responsible for his arrival at the conclusion that tourism was an important facilitator of foreign relations. The degree to which Menzies discerned travel's progressive capacity from his own travel experience, both within and outside of Australia, has also received scant attention. Similarly, little is known about Menzies' close association with the ANTA, the Australian National Travel Association, which dated back to Menzies' formative years in Melbourne in the late 1920s. This paper aims to fill some of these gaps. So, what did Menzies say when he took to the podium? His speech underlined the idea that travel was not only economically beneficial, but also that it had a higher purpose, helping individuals from different nations find common ground and understanding. It was not the scenery that a tourist should set out to see, he said, arguing, primarily it is the people, what they are like, and what they do. We are all different people. Many of us speak English of a kind, and many of us do not. But the differences of language tend to fall away a little, and people do get to know each other. Menzies said that nothing could be more remarkable than the impact of moving around for a few days or a few weeks among other people, sensing the atmosphere of a place, getting an impression of what the people there are really like, and above all, discovering that they are all human beings. He believed that travel instituted better relations between individuals of different nationalities, therefore harmonising relations between nations. A brief visit to another country could reveal this shared humanity. It could offer a cure for the animosities that had plagued the first half of the 20th century. In Menzies' words, this century of ours has been disfigured by prejudice and hatred more than any other century, far exceeding in these things the worst period of the Middle Ages. There is no cure for prejudice half as good as getting to know the person or race or community about which you have been prejudiced. Menzies' experience of and ideas about travel are relatively under-examined. Historians often interpret Menzies' diaries of overseas travel as representative of his closed-mindedness and allegiance to British culture. Judith Brett. In The Forgotten People concludes that Menzies was singularly lacking in curiosity about other people and other cultures and other ways of life. Writing on his first significant overseas travel in 1935, Brett argues that this journey awakened in Menzies no excitement about the variety of experience. Rather, everything he saw merely confirmed his belief in the superiority of the English. Unfortunately, it's outside the scope of this chapter to revisit the pre-war travel diaries, and I don't want to jump the gun on a future submission for the Institute. But this characterisation of Menzies as uninterested in testing and expanding his views seems out of step with his rhetoric at the Paddock Conference in 1964. So what explains these opposing visions of Menzies? Was he a frozen Edwardian, as some critics have charged, or did his liberal philosophy affirm an open-minded approach to the world? I think, of course, an important caveat is that Menzies' outlook wasn't perhaps as fixed across time as we tend to think it is. He was also disposed in his public speaking to make kind of romantic expatiations of humanistic optimism. His philosophic idealism, a belief that the central forces driving history were intellectual and spiritual in nature, was clearly in full swing when he penned his words for Patter's delegates. Perhaps after celebrating his wife's birthday, his confidence in mankind was running a little high. I suspect this was not the case. His rhetoric in 1964 suggests a broader, more idealistic view of the world than he is probably remembered as having. The relationship between travel and Menzies' belief in a common humanity was an extension of his liberal philosophy, which above all things elevated the autonomy of individuals. A strain of British cultural idealism, or cultural puritanism, that had taken root in 1920s Melbourne was key to Menzies' philosophical development. Those shaped by this cultural and intellectual movement emphasised the moral and spiritual advancement of humanity as central to progress. In Menzies, this atmosphere of spiritual idealism animated convictions that would become the pillars of his local but also global outlook. Imperial allegiance, limited government, individual freedom, the fostering of a national spirit, foreign relations, all of Menzies' views on these big questions were somehow touched by that Melbourne idealism, much of which is evident in the passages that I've cited from his 1964 speech. His idealism on travel did have economic dimensions. In one section of the speech, he spoke on a hypothetical visit of Australians to Japan and of Japanese to Australia. He said, when somebody from Japan comes over here to buy wool, or somebody from Australia goes to Japan to buy textiles, what they are doing is dealing with one facet of a whole complex of economic cooperation. Both would think it silly, though, he pointed out, to be told that they are extending these boundaries. One would say, practically, I am here to buy wool. The other would say, I am here to buy textiles. Nevertheless, said Menzies, because of this exchange, they contribute to a two-way trade that facilitated trust, broke down barriers, and diminished the chance of future conflict. Not coincidental was the invocation of relations with a former adversary, whose delegates now sat before Menzies, engaged in the very two-way trade he described. Herein lay the importance of tourism to world affairs. As Menzies passionately declared, this trade, which I shall call the tourist trade, is of tremendous importance as a remover of sources of international friction. His rhetoric resembled more than just a hope for economic cooperation. The speech indicates that his views on tourism aligned with his liberal ethos about citizenship and national unity. He had long argued that individual responsibility and engagement were key to building a strong nation. In earlier speeches to smaller tourism conferences, for instance, Menzies framed travel as an important element of citizenship, suggesting that travel formed a contract between ordinary citizens of different nations. His experience of travelling within Australia also informed his optimism about travel. In the 1964 address, he recalled that when he was a child, interstate travel was rare. States remained isolated from each other. He said that when he was a small boy, it was considered a phenomenal thing for anybody to travel interstate. We were parochial, he lamented. He added, today, with all the facilities of transport, with all the revolution that has gone on, assuming we can pay the fare, we have no excuse for not travelling. Advancements in transportation and the comparative affordability of travel increasingly empowered people to take holidays. In Australia, Menzies suggested greater access to travel had united the states and reduced parochialism. Australia's experience, he believed, could be replicated on a global scale. In Menzies' words, the average man and woman today is immeasurably better able to pay for some travel than their grandparents ever thought. Thousands and thousands of people coming in and thousands of people going out, all engaged, whether they realise it or not, in this ameliorative work in relation to our contacts with other countries. This revolution in travel was in large part facilitated by the National Travel Association, the organisation hosting the conference at which he was speaking. I hope to shed some light on Menzies' association with ANTA. Founded in 1929, ANTA was concerned with improving Australia's reputation overseas. Menzies' connection with ANTA dates back to the 1920s, during the early days of his legal and political career in Melbourne. Like many Victorians of the day, he admired Harold Clapp, the visionary leader of the Victorian Railways and the first chairman of ANTA. There is a distinct similarity in the rhetoric of Clapp and Menzies when it comes to travel. Clapp said in 1929, for example, that travel is not only an educator, it is a preserver of peace. As we have seen, this is a sentiment that Menzies' vision shared. Though Menzies compelled Clapp to oversee wartime aircraft production and railway gauge standardisation, little remains known about their personal relationship. An obituary wrote for the public servant in 1952 suggests a closer acquaintance between the two Victorians than has fully been explored to date. Menzies wrote that he had the singular good fortune to know Harold Clapp closely and to be in a position to estimate the value of his work. Their relationship dated back before Menzies entered Victoria Parliament. Menzies eulogised that it was his privilege to be, to some extent, his legal counsel and later to be his unofficial advisor on problems which went beyond the boundaries of the law. I kind of like this idea of Menzies as a fixer in 1920s railway Victoria. Menzies recalled that as Minister for Railways, he enjoyed the pleasure of constant association with Clapp in his administrative work. So this organisation that Clapp was a key part of, their stated mission was to overcome state parochialism and foster kind of national pride and project a positive image of Australia overseas. ANTA's campaigns aim to encourage Australians to travel within their own country, thereby strengthening national unity, much as Menzies' political rhetoric emphasised the importance of citizenship and collective national identity. ANTA was itself a product of the 1920s idealism that so shaped Menzies. Like the man that would become the nation's longest-serving Prime Minister, the the Travel Association also enjoyed widespread popularity with mainstream Australians. It was through the lens of Menzies' Melbourne-formed idealism that he intuited travel's civilising influence as a force for peace. In its spiritual aspect, travel promised to foster understanding, build relationships, and reduce the prejudice that divide nations and people. In this sense, travel went beyond the material experience of commercial tourism. It was a mechanism for the engendering of greater relations locally, but also nationally and globally. Menzies said to the delegates, "This travel you are encouraging is, I believe, one of the most civilising influences in the modern world." For Menzies, travel in the modern world did not mean luxuriating in the modern amenities of places like the hotel where he spoke. Travel served a deeper purpose than flambéed crepes at 3 a.m. At a time when the fatal consequences of war were still keenly felt, the notion that travel broadened the mind adduced the hopeful thought that modern nations could keep at bay the destruction and slaughter heralded by multinational conflict. Travel's enduring capacity to broaden the mind and bring people together remains as true today as it did in the 1960s. Indeed, many tourism campaigns still reach for this message today, even if the resonance is dimmed by the crowded marketplace of modern tourist advertising. For Menzies, though, it was the individual spirit, unhindered by the borders imposed by states, that promised to advance the cause of peace. Relations between nations began with individual people, free to explore the world at their pleasure. In the Forgotten People address, Menzies declared that if the new world is to be a world of men, we must not be pallid and bloodless ghosts, but a community. His 1964 address at Pata gives expression to how he imagined the formation of such a community could occur. Thank you. That's the very modern Menzies Hotel before it was knocked down in 2017. It's gone.
Yeah, I must say, the Menzies Hotel is the bane of my existence because the amount of false hits you get on Trove searching for things with Menzies. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So, in relation to Menzies' attitude towards foreign policy throughout his life, he changed from, he was more modern, more foresightful than what has been led to believe, especially from after the Second World War. Like he wanted to improve relations with many Asian countries, didn't he? And
From what I like, so I'm part of the early career program. A lot of this is new to me, and I've really come at Menzies from the angle of his statements on travel and on tourism. So it's difficult for me to speak with authority on sort of how foreign relations and things like his aspirations for sort of greater regional relations fit in. But I'll definitely be considering those as I finalise the paper.
sure.
It's knock-off time.
I'll ask a question. So, how you mentioned that Menzies sort of propagated the idea that tourism was really important in breaking down Australian parochialism. How long had that idea been in gestation? Was this something that was a deliberate sort of tactic by governments over a long period of time, or is it something that's more a hindsight as travel became more common, you saw what was happening?
So the Australian National Travel Association, which grows out of the Victorian Railways, has this sort of, at its core, and almost more than anything else, to reduce those strongly felt state identities and institute a kind of national identity. And it's occurring not through government, and often quite proudly through this Australian National Travel Association, which is a public-private hybrid, which are lobbying throughout the 1930s in the early part of their existence quite significantly for Commonwealth support. But a reading of those ANTA archives still sort of suggests that they're not getting the support that they need for the mission that they're tasking themselves with. However, their materials and their publications and their advertisements are in ever-increasing demand with the publics that they're communicating them to, suggesting that there's a sort of appetite for the transnational or national identity that is strong in their materials. This dates back to the 1920s and probably through this sort of Stanley Bruce period where there's big concerns after the failure of the resettlement scheme, soldiers' resettlement scheme, and sort of ongoing droughts and economic difficulty that Australia's not doing enough to market itself sufficiently overseas. But also going even further back to the First World War, there's this idea there that travel can really help people overcome these differences within Australia. And in the philosophy of the organisation, they speak to this higher idea of we all need to cooperate. We're bigger than I'm a Victorian, you're from New South Wales. And Harold Clapp's definitely really big on that. So something that I'd like to look at going forward and appeal to the sort of collective knowledge of the room on is how much of this did Menzies absorb in Melbourne, or how much of it was part of this sort of spiritual idealism that Melhuish and Chikura talk about? Yeah, I don't really know.
First up, how many of those crepes ever got delivered? Have you counted them? I mean, were they popular? But that's an aside. That's your next project.
Yeah.
But Menzies, that I've read about, loved travel. I mean, the trip that he took was gruelling, to Britain in 1941, was literally kangaroo hops right across the globe, trips in the Middle East, all the way down to South Africa, back up again into England. But afterwards, he's also on the cusp of the opening up of the airways. You know, the idea that you took 6 months that was the problem with prime ministers, to go to the Imperial Conference. They were 5 months away from home. So isn't it also that he's seeing this as a trade, not just a trade, discuss why Australia's good for trade, but it's also part of our economy now, that for the first time we can link people up, as you were saying, but also benefit from it. Because he took his camera with him when he went off to the 1941 visit, like a tourist, but in fact it was terrible times. So he sort of must have, to some extent, picked up on the idea of travel as an industry and a good idea for Australia being so far away. Is that in it too?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of his the appeal of travel to him, and he comes to international travel quite late in life. I think he's 41 when he travels to England in 1935, and those diaries are a really great insight into, I think, how for a person of his time, new experiences, he is being exposed to new experiences, and they are testing his perhaps preconceived notions about the world. But you know, it is a matter of interpretation. But one of the sources that I draw from in the final paper, he speaks at a P&O opening and talks about how many miles he's had to fly with Qantas and how nostalgic he is for this sort of age of shipboard travel. But there's definitely an awareness in all of these speeches that he's making in this sort of modern period where this revolution in travel has occurred, that Australia, and much as ANTA's rhetoric has been, he is really advocating for this to be conceived of just as ANTA had. And I think this is a really important point to drive home, like the congruence between his rhetoric and the rhetoric of Harold Clapp, to speak of it in terms of an industry, that if Australia is not a pace of, they will suffer because we are further away. The imperative of having a positive reputation about Australia overseas to not, isolate Australia. These are all coming through in these travel-themed speeches in the 60s, and I think just really have that strong connection to the rhetoric of the Travel Association that he's speaking with.
Yeah, this is just a comment about the 1920s. That statement of Clapp's about you've got to not think of yourself as a Victorian or a New South Wales person or whatever. It's very similar to Deakin saying at Federation, we've got to put on federal field glasses. I think that for the political elites, particularly before World War II, like national identity was sort of slightly weaker, much weaker than it became in the 50s and the 60s, the period you're talking about. And that they were very aware that there was a need for people to transcend their colonial/state loyalties to develop national loyalties. How that shifts, I think, something to think about. But it was just a comment about what I think is going on in the 1920s, which I think looks back to Federation as much as forward to the 60s.
I think I've got one last question and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Josh. This isn't really even a comment, it's kind of a half-formed thought. While you were talking, the two images just came to mind. And Australia's ramping up its commitment to Vietnam. The Vietnam War, 1964, 1965, is the beginning of large-scale commitment. And I'm just thinking, the technological changes is moving a lot of people around the world and is making those kind of cultural differences, things to be really managed in different ways, I think is part of this story. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, I've just got that image while you were talking of Menzies with a camera. And yes, Menzies travels enormously and he captures a lot of the world through the camera. But again, this is an abstract reference, but the way in which Susan Sontag writes about how this generation, through photography, is coping with difference, is coping with challenges, making difference kind of normal, but distancing it, managing it, I think is part maybe of this story, what travel represents to somebody of Menzies' generation in coping with a huge amount of change in mobility, in exposure to other cultures, interventions in other cultures. That might seem an abstract thought, but 1964 addressing that conference, 1965 Vietnam, the television war, the war of massive mobility, I think just struck me as a really interesting kind of parallel.
Yeah. To kind of comment on a comment, I guess, it interests me, some of the speech, so it's not lost on me the sort of bigger context here and what's occurring, and that Menzies probably, I think in a lot of the speeches that I've read, has a real urge to connect with his audience. So we have to read these speeches carefully and not isolate them from the bigger technological and cultural changes and foreign policy changes, for sure. However, an interesting thing that I try and draw on in the draft chapter here is even at his famous Lake Burley Griffin speech, where he talks about, like the reeds are a bit rough, but that's how we like it. He has a sense of how, in a very small part of the speech, just a couple of sentences, how this is going to be a symbolic place for people to converge on from all around Australia. So that's kind of another thing that's occurring. And, so even though we've got to read him carefully, he's still sort of got this awareness of travel as an important industry and of a way of putting people beside each other from all over a large continent and sort of finding some of their, shared values in holidays. So, but yeah, thank you everyone for your feedback.
Thanks, Josh. So that obviously concludes day one. I hope you've all learnt a lot. It's great to have such a full room and so many engaged questions. Thank you all very much for coming. For those of you who are coming tomorrow, and I hope as many of you as possible are coming for the second day tomorrow, we reconvene at 8:30 with registrations opening, and then it's 9 o'clock sharp for the events to kick off again. So thank you all. Ta.